Assalamu alaikum everyone, and Jazakallah khair for coming and for taking part and taking the time out to be here for what is going to be quite a good conversation, but a difficult conversation. I wanted to direct your attention to the chat box. So the chat box has a fair few links in there, and I wanted to direct your attention to the one for help and support. If anyone requires to go there, please do. And just throughout the conversation, just please feel free to go away, make a cup of tea. If it gets too much, just take your time with it all, inshallah. We are hoping that the session lasts for a couple of hours, and that includes questions, hopefully. I should probably introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Maria. I am the founder and currently the managing director of Sacred Body Mind Space. So Sacred was set up, it was established back now in 2022 with a very clear aim, which is to research abuse in Scottish Muslim communities, and that's what we've been doing. You will find the link to our first research publication also in the chat box, inshallah. I'm also currently completing my PhD at Chester University, and my area is spiritual abuse. We are also collaborating today with Unity Family Services, whose information you'll also find in the chat box, inshallah. So the format for today is that we have Shaykh Amer and Dr. Rahmanara, who I will introduce in a little while. I will basically put out some questions, we'll have a discussion, and we would appreciate and like questions, and we would request that you put them in the chat box, and then inshallah we'll just have to find the ones that we have the most amount of time for. And if we don't get through all the questions, we will aim to do that in some other format at a later time, inshallah. So, okay, I think I've covered everything. I'm just going to introduce the two speakers that we have with us today. Shaykh Amer probably doesn't need an introduction. I think most people know him, but for those of you that don't know him, Shaykh Amer holds a law degree from Strathclyde University, and he also has a BA in Islamic Studies from the University of Wales. He spent 10 years studying the Islamic sciences, including 5 years with scholars in the Middle East, in Syria and Yemen, gaining a teaching license in various Islamic sciences. His main field of interest is Islamic family law, something that he studied in depth, having studied all 4 schools of Islamic jurisprudence. In 2009, he co-founded the Solas Foundation with Sheikh Rizwan Muhammad and established the iSyllabus Islamic Studies program. So we're also joined today by Dr. Rahmanara. Dr. Rahmanara Chowdhury, she is a chartered psychologist and a senior lecturer in forensic psychology at Nottingham Trent University. She has an undergraduate degree in ergonomics, a master's in psychology, and she completed her PhD at Brunel University. Her research interests include domestic violence and abuse, spiritual abuse, forensic mental health, intersectionality, and holistic well-being. She was also the co-lead on the research with Sacred, so she is very, very familiar with the work that we are doing. Just to give you some context, today's session is the second session with Shaykh Amer and follows on from the discussion that we had earlier last year, which was focused on Muslim spaces and safeguarding. And I'm hoping you can watch this soon, inshallah, on YouTube, I'm being told. So if you wanted to kind of listen a bit more on that very specific topic, you can go and have a look at that. But today's conversation, inshallah, is a broad conversation on abuse in Muslim communities, but within this, we hope to pick up on some key and relevant areas, and really, namely looking at leadership and authority figures, all of which is cushioned in the term spiritual abuse. So I think to kind of maybe just start off, Dr. Rahmanara, if I can go to yourself, would you be able to start this discussion by defining what we mean by spiritual abuse and why we're using this term today?
Yeah, welcome everyone. Can you hear me okay, firstly?
Yes, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, inshallah, I'll try to answer that. So bismillah. So when we're trying to define spiritual abuse, at the moment, generally the definitions come from the Quran, the Hadith, and the Ijma'. So 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 the Quran, the Had the sort of mainstream platforms, and a lot of that focuses on the Christian context, and that's mainly due to what's happened in the church. Now, obviously, we know that spiritual abuse isn't something that's unique to the Christian context. It can happen in any faith groups, and actually, I've had lots of conversations with members of different faith groups where it's very much present there as well. When we look at theories which help us to understand why abuse occurs, oftentimes it's very much about a set of circumstances that come together to facilitate opportunities for abuse. So you're thinking about the context and what's going on in the context. Now, within that wider context, one element of that may be where faith or religion might be intertwined. So at present, a number of definitions have been put forward by different academic scholars, again, within the predominantly within the church context. But just I'm going to draw on that, and I'm going to draw on my own research and the work, obviously, that Sacred has done to say that basically spiritual abuse can manifest in two ways. So you've got either an individual who holds a position of spiritual or religious authority, and they might abuse that power by taking advantage of others or inflicting harm upon others. And that is directly in relation to the fact that they hold that position of authority. The other thing you might also see is that actually it can be anyone who misuses religion, or they use spiritual tools such as scripture or practices and various sort of faith-based principles in order to inflict harm on another person. Now, there are a couple of things we need to think about. So within the Muslim tradition, is the idea that it doesn't really matter how much you practice the faith. The moment you identify as a Muslim, that becomes central to your identity, to your core identity. So that means any kind of abuse which has elements of spirituality and the religion involved in it, it becomes spiritual abuse by default, because it goes to the very core of who you are as a person. And therefore, that has implications for the level of harm and how great that harm is. So that's not really a short definition, but that's just an idea of the kind of debates that's happening in terms of understanding and defining spiritual abuse. Now, I do want to also just say that there are discussions about whether we should be using the term spiritual abuse, and whether, if this is something that gets incorporated into law, then will it make it even more difficult for Muslim communities? Is it going to lead to greater discrimination? But actually, I just want to make it clear that here we're not having that conversation. That's a separate conversation. We're not advocating for the term to be made a legal term. Whenever I think about definitions, what I do is I go to the people who have been affected by this issue. So whenever I've worked with people, I've looked at, okay, what are they saying to me? What have they said about their experiences? How do they identify the experience? What is meaningful for them? And based on that information, this body of work, basically, that has now informed my thinking in regards to this. And so those who are most affected, they identify it in the sense that, yes, it's spiritual abuse. And so therefore, we've adopted this term in terms of reflecting their experiences.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Rahmanara, for that. I'm going to move straight on from kind of looking at that definition and understanding that a big part of it is those that are in positions of leadership and authority, when they abuse that power, that also kind of falls under spiritual abuse. Shaykh, historically, we know that implicit trust in scholars is traditionally been seen, I guess, in a way to create community cohesion and spiritual growth. Our research, Sacred's research, demonstrated that religious leaders hold a significant standing and power within Scottish Muslim communities. And this is actually true across all communities, and there's other research that backs this up. So kind of this kind of responsibility is something that we can maybe find difficult to understand as people that are on the receiving side of that, in terms of how do we engage with someone who is in a position of power. We've had instances of participants who've told us how abusive situations have occurred as a result of this. So how do we ensure that trust does not lead to unchecked power or harm within the community? So from an Islamic perspective, what are the boundaries of this trust? And more importantly, how do we hold scholars and leadership and people who are in a position of leadership accountable when that trust is broken?
Okay, so assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. Just make sure everyone can hear me okay, and then we'll inshallah continue. You can hear me okay, Maria, yes? And see me? Okay. So I think it's a very pertinent question in light of maybe recent events or things. I mean, people that are involved in this area are probably not as surprised, but I think the public, when something's in the news, it's brought to their attention. But whether it's in the news or not in the news, the thing is that breaches of trust happen across the board in all facets of life. Sometimes we read about doctors that have done something and then they've been struck off because of that. So it does happen across fields. It's not something specific to just people or scholars or people in positions of responsibility. And it also happens in all communities. So it happens in every single community: harm, abuse, breaches of trust. These things unfortunately happen in all communities. Obviously, for us, we're focusing primarily on the Muslim community because that's the community we deal with. You're right that scholars or people in positions of responsibility in our community are given a certain degree of reverence, degree of respect that maybe is unique. But I think that there's a few themes that we need to really be clear on, and I think sometimes what happens is there's general statements which are made, and I'll get to them, like, you're innocent till proven guilty, and they're applied across the board. Another one is, sins should always be covered up. So there's a quote from Umar al-Khattab, and Umar al-Khattab is actually really interesting for us for this discussion because he, becomes the Khalifa, and under his caliphate, the Ummah really increases, it really spreads. So a lot of policies and procedures come in at his time. And obviously he being the second Khalifa, the Prophet ﷺ said, if anyone had the abilities of being a prophet after me, it would have been him. He's one of the greats of our religion. So his understanding of Islam is going to be much greater than any of us our time. So what he does and how he applies Islamic principles is really interesting. So one of the things he said was, do not let yourselves be impressed by the roar of a man, right? So you can understand that as, how eloquent that person may be, or maybe gives very fervent, Friday sermons or whatever. But he said, rather, if he fulfills the trust, and it's interesting because you asked breaches of trust, he uses that same word, amana. If he fulfills the trust, because if you're put in that position, it's a position of trust, and restrains himself from harming the honor of people, then he will truly be a man. Then he's a man, right? In other words, if he doesn't, then he's not that. So that's really interesting. He focused on fulfilling the trust and restraining from harming people, meaning because he has that ability because of the position he's in. Accountability is also a huge theme in our religion. We in Surah Fatiha, third verse, Maliki Yawmiddin, we're reminded Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the master of the day of judgment. So we're reminding ourselves we're going to be accountable in the next life. Accountability is really important in our religion, in this world and in the next world. So justice, to the best of our ability, has to be performed in this world, and obviously real or complete justice will happen in the next life. I think the thing with the understanding when it's a breach of trust is, say that person is a teacher of Quran. So they have a set role, and the set role is you're going to go there and you're going to learn the Quran. That is what you're going there for. You're not going for anything else. Where that person starts to use their position for alternative reasons, such as trying to get money out of you or get you to do things against your will, manipulate you in essence, then that's a breach of trust because that's not their role. They shouldn't be doing that. They are, um, you know, um, they're breaching boundaries. Um, and like I said, this is not something specific to just a Quran teacher. It could happen in politics. It happens in the police. It happens in teachers, teachers with pupils. We hear about these reports all the time. This is a human thing. And the first thing that we have to teach people is that yes, we respect the scholars, yes, we have reverence for them, but nobody is above the law. No one is above the law. Only the prophets are infallible. We don't even give that to the companions. And we know there are companions who committed sins and sometimes major sins. Okay, we know of that companion who drank alcohol, for example. So, um, and they're the companions. They're the best of people after the Prophet ﷺ. So nobody is above the law, and if the Sharia boundaries are crossed, then it's a breach. And the Prophet emphasized this. There's an incident where somebody had committed theft, and they went to an intermediary to the Prophet ﷺ to try and get an easier result for themselves. And the Prophet got very angry, and he said that the people before you were destroyed because they would apply the law to some people and not to some. And we see this in in our lives, in politics, how there seems to be one law for the rich and powerful and one law for everyone else. We saw this in COVID. Everyone was supposed to follow the rules of COVID. People in power were breaching them, or some of them. So no one's above the law, no one's above the Islamic law. And so the Quran teacher, the Imam, the scholar, everyone has to follow that. And the Prophet said, he said, by Allah, even if my daughter had committed that sin, I would have applied the punishment. So he's making a point. Me, my daughter, everyone has to follow the law. The Sharia is for everyone. It doesn't apply to some people or no one gets an exception. No one gets special treatment. So there should be no special treatment, first of all and foremost, for scholars or imams or anyone in positions of power. If there is a breach of trust, it's a breach of trust. What makes it obviously worse is that that person is supposed to be in a higher moral standing, so it actually makes their breach of trust even worse than a normal person. And so what we need to be doing on a consistent basis is to educate our community of the boundaries that we should all have. I mean, there's no harm in going over these things over and over again. Just to reiterate to everyone, for example, we have the concept of khalwa, and khalwa is being alone with somebody of the opposite gender. It's not permissible. And there's a statement that says al khalwa haram walau kanat bi Maryam bint Imran. Right? So khalwa is not permissible, even if it was with Mary, the daughter of Imran. In other words, because obviously Mary's got a high level of chastity and purity. In other words, it doesn't matter what the situation is. It's not allowed. It's not allowed. And that's why we have very strict guidelines, like touching the opposite sex and things like that, inappropriate interactions. We have the concept of aura, that you have a nakedness and no one's allowed to see your nakedness, and that applies across the board. So we teach this to our children when they're changing in the for PE, or if you're at the gym. These things are part and parcel of our religion, also our cultural kind of practice. And so we have to teach people that, look, if this gets breached and people start asking you for money, you get people who will take advantage of people. They'll say, oh, you've got sihr, you've got magic, and if you don't give me £1,000, your situation's going to get worse. And if you give me £1,000, I can do X, Y, Z for you. And people are manipulated into giving money. So all of these are breaches of trust. Obviously, the worst would be a kind of sexual context. And the thing is, we have to understand that we may have a good opinion of someone, but we don't know the reality of that person. Right? None of us knows, for example, none of us can put our hand up and say, I'm going to paradise. Nobody, right? إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالْخَوَاتِيمِ. The hadith says that actions are but by the ends. We don't know in what state we will die. So that's the first thing. So with this, person, whoever we're revering, we don't know what their end is. Number two, we also have um, clear hadith that indicate that not everything which is apparent is reality. So, for example, the Prophet ﷺ, said the first person to enter hellfire, and he mentioned three people: the martyr, the scholar, on one narration, the teacher of Quran, right? And then the person who gives a lot of wealth. And the reason was because outwardly they were doing the right thing, but inwardly the reason was something else, right? There was no sincerity, they had no value for that action. So there's a hadith, and it's authentic hadith. So that shows you not everybody who's in that position is doing it for the right reasons. And we don't judge people, we obviously go by the apparent, but it gives us that caution that, not every scholar or imam is there because they had a burning desire to learning the religion. It could be that their father was a scholar. It's a family thing. Just like you get people who are their parents are doctors, they become doctors. Joiners, they become joiners. It's like a family thing. Or it could be like in Pakistan, India, a lot of the people that go to madrasas, they go due to poverty. They're orphans. They don't have anything. It's a place where they will get a roof over their head. They'll get clothes. They'll get, yeah, food, and they can make a living out of it. So for some of them, it might even just be like a job, just like if you're doing any other job. Some of them could have been sent to these madrasas because they were troubled kids. The parents couldn't deal with them, right? And another thing is that they're human beings. Maybe they had traumatic upbringings and they're struggling themselves with following the Islamic laws just at a human level. So I think we've got to be very careful not being black and white that, okay, person's a scholar, that means they're close to God, they're going to heaven, and they can do no wrong. It's more nuanced than that. And there's, scholars have talked about this, the evil scholars or the worst scholars. So Abdullah bin Barr, he said, the worst rulers are far from the scholars, and the worst scholars are near to the rulers. Meaning that there are bad scholars, you could say there are bad people who are in the scholarly ranks. And we've also seen, if you just look in our own lives, we've seen there were scholars who sided with the Assad regime in Syria. So, they're not, you get the good, the bad, and the ugly in every field, including the religious field, And they're not fallible. Sorry, they are fallible. They're not infallible. They can sin. They can get things wrong. They can sometimes start off okay, and then you're having a low point in their life, and they do something wrong. Um, Obviously, when a sin is committed by somebody who should know better, it's a lot worse. So I think we have to be more cautious. It's not that we don't respect scholars, we don't have reverence for them, but it's almost like you should respect them from a distance. It's like I think in our time, the example of Salman Farsi is really important. So if Salman Farsi, as you know, comes to Medina, he's a slave, but he just doesn't go to the Prophet and become Muslim. He's been told that there's three signs, so he tests them. He goes and tests them one day, and then he goes back, and so this is a process of going back and forth. He's looking for the evidence before he makes a decision. So again, we can't. We need to keep our intellect open at all times and using at all times, so that we're looking at the evidence. We're looking at not what the person's maybe just saying, but what they're saying, is that correlating to the religion? And it could be that they're saying something, they're doing something different. Are the actions in accordance with the law? Does this match my understanding of what the Prophet was like? And then even to ask, well, does this actually agree with the spirit of religion? Does it feel Islamic? Like, would God be happy with what this person's saying to me or doing or asking? And another really important point, which I'll finish on this question, is go with your gut. So if if you have a gut feeling that something's not right here, because there's this hadith about this, you know, that if something irritates you inside, it's like a radar. It's like like something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put in the person. It's to almost bring your attention to it. Right? If something irritates you inside, if something feels wrong inside, it probably is. And so at that point, what people need to do is pause and just take some time out. Just take some time out and think. Speak to a close friend, get their opinion. Do istikhara. We're told to do istikhara. When you make any kind of decision to do anything, do istikhara. And so that's a really important point, that gut or something inside that's telling you. I just had a recent person who wanted to go on Umrah, and I gave her all the opinions, and she came back to me and said, so she knows that the opinions, but she goes that something's not feeling right about it. So I said, do istikhara. Do istikhara, speak to your family, do istikhara, and then make a decision. Just because it says it's permissible doesn't mean you need to do it. So I think all of those things are important for us to keep in mind when it comes to this question.
Jazakallah khair. I think two of the things that really stuck out for me is this idea of really creating a bridge between positive trust and blind following. Because from what I hear from different people across different kind of communities, is this idea that we tend to blindly follow sheikh or scholars. And so that's a really good point. And secondly, this idea about our gut. I don't think we talk enough about that. I'm wondering if I can bring you in, Dr. Rahmanara, to kind of maybe talk a little bit about the psychological position on this. I guess on a social and psychological level, what does the breaking of a trust, this trust that we've been talking about, that's so important between a leader and a member of the community, what does that do on a community level, and how do we tackle some of this both on a social and psychological, from a psychological perspective? Sorry.
Yeah, it's a really important question. Just based on the work that I've been involved in, when you look at it on a social level, the breaking of trust that occurs actually on a collective level, it's magnifying what happens on an individual psychological level to a person who is put through abuse. And that's basically essentially that person's, as I mentioned before, their core identity and all their social networks, all their places of safety, everywhere that they would have turned to as a place of belonging, actually, all of those connections, it becomes fragmented. So that happens on the individual level, but then it happens as a wider ripple effect. It happens across the community as well and across different communities. I think the best way to try and describe it, so if you imagine, I don't know, you're taking like a hammer to a car window and you smash that glass. That first time, the hammer's not likely to go through. You're likely to end up with all those cracks in that windscreen. So that's how I kind of imagine it when I speak to people, this idea that you've got a person who then has all these kind of disconnected and disjointed parts. And, just from looking at it externally, it feels like, how will you ever put all of that back together again? There's so many pieces and fragments of glass. How are you going to, where does that person kind of start again? So that's what happens at the individual level, and that's what happens through communities. And I think the most recent example, we've really seen that. So that person, they're going to be looking around them, everything they thought was familiar, and actually they're not going to be able to connect because that trust is no longer there. The biggest psychological impact, I would say, is going to come because the person who broke that trust was someone they potentially looked up to and held in a significant position, and are seen as someone as having, a significant position in society, having that religious authority, and in a sense, who they viewed as almost like a representation of the faith as well. So you've got all of those kind of disconnects that are going to happen on that kind of level. Now, when you see that ripple through communities, the immediate, again, going back to this gut that you were talking about, is, in a sense, I feel like it's our fitra almost calling out. So the easiest thing to do in that kind of situation is actually to point fingers, because people feel anger, justifiably they feel anger, why has this happened? Lots of other questions. But actually, it's at that point that the very thing we need to do is we need to stand back and we need to reflect, and we need to think about, okay, this thing that's happened, why did it happen? How was it able to happen? what kind of factors were present which allowed such a circumstance to take place. Now, that's not the same as saying that the abuse is okay, and we're not justifying any wrongs or any harms or anything like that. There's no circumstances under which abuse is going to be okay. But what it's about is thinking about, this harm has happened. We have to ensure that it doesn't happen again. And that's a very difficult thing to do. In order to ensure that it doesn't happen again, we have to take a few steps back and work our way backwards, almost by going back to, well, why did this happen in the first place? So in terms of that community kind of impact, actually what we need is for communities to come together and alleviate the potential further harms that can happen in such a situation. And that really requires, taking that step back, thinking and having a thoughtful approach. Just on a practical level, some of the things that can be done at a community level, I think the very first thing that has to happen is there has to be an acknowledgement that there was harm that was done. If that acknowledgement doesn't happen, what you actually do in that process is you cause greater harm and you affect more people. So there has to be a recognition and an acknowledgement of the harm, so that you've drawn a clear line of, actually, this is not acceptable, and we as community members do not accept this as well. We also then need to, obviously, I think the primary thing everyone will kind of go to is the victim and those who have been directly impacted, and thinking about, okay, so what do we need to put in place for that person or those people? Some of that might be tangible support, some of it might be therapeutic in nature. Usually it will involve the people who are closest to those individuals. It might involve external professional services as well. So that's another key area to think about. I think one of the things communities don't always realise that collectively we actually hold a lot of power. I'm not going to talk about that just right now, because I think we'll come to it a bit later. But collectively, what we do means we do have a lot of power, and we can change how topics like this are addressed in communities. But as I said, I'll talk about that a bit later. And then the final kind of point in terms of what we can do on a sort of community level is to think about, so people who are already working in this area, and people who hold those positions of authority and responsibility, the individuals who have the right skill set, people who work within legal frameworks as well. This idea of actually people in those roles coming together, thinking about what's required, thinking about the communities that they're working with and what those communities need at that time. And it will be different for different communities, so we have to bear that in mind, and to make that collective concerted effort to think about what kind of strategies do we need to put in place at the community level. So this is those people in those positions who can help to create a greater movement, but also that has to be alongside change that happens within the grassroots, and that's about the collective power that we have within communities. That sounds a bit vague at the moment, but just to give you an overarching idea of some of the things that can be done within communities.
Jazakallah khair. You kind of touched on or referenced, I guess, the very public, traumatic discovery that came out of the States not that long ago. And in part, that's one of the reasons why we are doing this session today, to kind of look at or talk a little bit about the trust, the shock and the trauma that comes from the breaking of that trust. I feel like Muslim communities everywhere have been experiencing shock and disbelief. For some, it's been denial. For others, it will have been really traumatic as people process their own experiences. And I think there's also been a profound individual and communal, I guess the term for it is moral confusion, on hearing that someone who is a trusted member of a community or an organization has violated all sorts of boundaries. And this is something, we've demonstrated very clearly in our own research and in other research as well. This idea that victims are usually not believed, dismissed. We found this to be true in our research, physically silenced, by individuals and institutions. Additionally, we were told by some people that there is a real imperative to cover sins and protect families and communities, and that this really was a really strong driving force for remaining silent. Sheikh, if I can ask you to maybe cover some of this, is it sinful to raise awareness about abusive actions and actually also criminal actions of individuals in positions of authority, and how do we balance the legal obligation to report harm with the Islamic principles of protecting dignity and confidentiality?
I think this is a really critical question that you're asking. Like you said, in the backdrop of what happened. I think just as I was listening to you there, you're saying that the shock and stuff, what came to my mind was, when ISIS came around and, even in Afghanistan, places like that, there are people who will think it's permissible to blow up people at a Jummah khutbah. And we see this all the time. So this corruption that people have, and these people can quote you Quran, they can quote you Hadith, but it's a corrupted understanding of the faith. This can occur, and we see it actually occurring. It's just that we just don't join the dots. So this happens. In terms of your question, so going back to the question, the thing is, we have a certain principle, and I think this is one of the ones that things are a bit blurry on this question. People need to really understand this point. That yes, we have a concept that you should conceal the sins of your brother. The hadith in Bukhari and Muslim, man satara musliman satarahu Allah fi dunya wal akhirah. Whoever conceals a Muslim's sins, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will conceal their sins in this life and the next life. So the thing is, to understand the hadith is correct, but it's how you understand the hadith. The way scholars understand that hadith, this is talking about private sins. So let's say a religious leader was doing something haram, but he's doing it in his home and it doesn't affect anyone, right? Let's say he's eating something haram, or he's smoking weed or drinking alcohol, something like that, but nobody knows about this. No one knows about it. There's no harm to other people. He doesn't go around harming other people. It's just something he's struggling with. Maybe he's got some trauma. Maybe he's, got had his wife's left him and he's in a bad place, whatever it might be. So he's fallen into this type of sin, and you've come to know of that, right? In that situation, it's not translating into harm to other people, to the congregation, to the community. That's a different situation. In that situation, where we give people counsel, we give them nasiha, and we cover the sins. We don't go around spreading it all over Facebook or Instagram. However, there are situations where we should not conceal people's sins, right? Just in general, I'm talking about. So the examples would be marriage. So we know that somebody is considering someone for marriage. They come to you and say, "Listen, I'm considering this brother. Do you know anything about this brother?" And you know that guy drinks, and you know that this person's a practicing Muslim, and they wouldn't accept someone who drinks. And you say, "Listen, well, now that you've asked, yes, I do know that he drinks, right?" So that's in marriage. Or business, somebody comes to you and says, "Listen, I'm going into business with this person. What do you think? I heard you know him or know her. What do you think?" And you say, "Listen, this guy, was involved in VAT fraud 2 years ago or something. I think you should be careful." So this thing about concealing sins at all times in all situations is not true. As a general rule, there are exceptions. There are exceptions to this, exceptions to backbiting. Someone who openly displays sin or oppression and is not hiding it. Someone's got a pub and that's what they do, and they put pictures up on their social media. They don't conceal their sin. You have no obligation to conceal their sin. Now that brings us on to, so that's just as a general rule for general Muslims in their private capacity, right? Now we're talking about people who are in positions of authority, religious authority, positions of influence in the community, and their actions have the potential for a lot of good, but at the same time, their actions also have the potential for a lot of harm on the community. So this is now not only it's not something now just relating to that person, it's relating to lots of people now. And here we have many principles in our Islamic law where we talk about the maslaha, right? The maslaha means welfare. So it's we have what's called legal maxims, qawaid fiqhiyah, like for example, that the maslaha of the community comes before the maslaha of one individual, right? So the welfare, the benefit of the community comes before the benefit of a person. And also something related to it, which I'll come back to because this is like a fundamental that we'll come back to, which is ad-dararu yuzal, right? That harm must be eliminated, right? So this is a really big, one of the big principles you could say of Islamic law, and I'll come back to it. So harm must be eliminated. So where there's harm to the community, we have a duty to eliminate it. And there's also a maxim which kind of related to that, which says, يُتَحَمَّلُ الضَّرَرُ الْخَاص لِلدَّفْعِ الضَّرَرِ الْعَامِ, that personal harm should be tolerated to prevent general harm. And then they give examples, like if there's an unqualified doctor, because there's harm to the community, right? So the harm to them is that they'll lose a living. But if we let the person practice, the harm is going to go out to the masses. And so the harm of the masses takes precedence over this individual harm. Interestingly, they also mention a mufti majin, which is like a careless mufti, because his fatwas can harm people. Right? And that's just a fatwa. Never mind if it's like, the kind of things we're talking about, where it's like, of a sexual nature or, financial nature or, physical nature, right? So I'm just giving you an idea of the kind of examples they gave. So these principles are already there, right? So when it comes to people who are holding positions of power and authority in the community, we have a different set of rules. So that's what we need to understand. There is a different set of rules for people who are in positions of power and authority. The same rules don't apply because of the virtue of their position and the impact and influence of their position. The other thing is anyone who has become an imam, a scholar, or somebody of power and authority, if you put yourself in that position, it comes with the job that you will be open to scrutiny as well. What's expected of you is at a higher standard than the lay person. So this is where that principle that gets flagged about. First of all, the first one was, well, you have to conceal the person's sins. No. If it's harming others, no, because now it's not just about the person, it's about the greater harm now. We're dealing with two harms. One is greater than the other. Number one. Number two is that this principle of innocent until proven guilty is similar. When it comes to a normal case, yes, this person's been accused of something, but we need proof for that. But if they're in a position where there's an accusation has been made about somebody in a position of power and authority, because of the impact of their work can have devastating effects on the community, that is deemed too valuable. So we're not going to even wait until we prove the person is guilty. We will remove that person and we will investigate it. So you could say suspended until investigated. And we have precedents for this, going back to Sayyidina Umar. Sayyidina Umar, when he was dealing with his governors, his judges, his military leaders, there's many instances where he would remove somebody, not because of something that they may have done, right? But because of he viewed it as the negative impact it would have on the community. And so he didn't, so he was weighing up the harm to the community and the harm to that individual. And obviously for some of the individuals it was humiliating if you've just been removed as a governor or something. But then he would make it clear afterwards his reason for it, that look, this person's not done anything wrong. However, this is my reasons for removing that person. right? Khalid bin Walid, a very famous incident where he came back from a battle and he just thought that people are thinking that they're winning the battles because of Khalid and forgetting it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Mm.
And, so that, and then there was also an incident where so he removed him as when there was one of the battles and he didn't want him to be the leader. So there's instances like that, and also where he was interrogated, you could say, publicly
Mm.
about giving certain money, and then when he proved that it came from him, he was let go. So Omar is weighing these things up, and he's saying, look, the harm to the community always, always, always takes precedent. And so he didn't have a problem removing people, even when they had not been proven to have done anything wrong. But if
Mm.
he felt that it's going to be harm to the greater community, that took precedent in his eyes. So this is where we have to take our understanding from the people who took their understanding from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we would remove that person, there's an accusation. We would investigate the matter, and this happens in all the time, isn't it? Sometimes MPs get suspended or other people get suspended, and
Mm.
things are investigated. And then if it's cleared, then it's fine. They go back to their work. If they're not, if they're found guilty, then they're removed. So it shouldn't come as a huge amount of surprise to us. So abuses of power and violations of trusts are not treated the same way as personal sins or
Mm.
personal mistakes. We have a different we deal with it differently, and that is extremely important because there has to be that accountability. So if we live in a society where something happens, someone gets suspended, we're sending a message to the community as well that we take things seriously. We don't just brush things under the carpet. You're right. We the betterment of the community is extremely important to us, and we're not taking any chances. And that accountability is extremely important because when there is lack of accountability, this is another important point. When there is lack of accountability, it opens a door up to oppression. And you see this in countries where there's dictators. There's
Yeah.
no one to there's no one to ask them. There's no checks and balances. They can do
Mm.
whatever they want. And it's something really interesting. Many years ago, Dr. Omar Farouk in the US, he came and I remember it was a really interesting point. He was saying that before the colonial powers came, he said in the Muslim world, you had obviously your political leadership, but you had your religious leadership. And he said the religious leadership was independent, right? They were independent. They were funded through endowments, awqaf.
Mm.
And because they were independent, the political leaders were always wary of keeping the religious scholars on board because they could get the masses going if they wanted. They could do a revolt.
Mm.
So they always had to, even if they wanted to do certain things, they're like, we need to go and see the sheikh and just make sure he's okay with it. And so this was too. It was like keeping everything balanced. And he said one of the things the colonial powers did is they took the endowments away of the scholars. That collapsed, and that he goes in, it opened up the door to the political leadership to basically go and check. And this is, we see the
Mm.
results of it. So the accountability is extremely, extremely important. This has got to be something which has got to become um, top priority in our communities.
So there's a couple of things, if I may, I wanted to just give you some follow-up questions. The thing that struck me about when you were talking about people, scholars who are in a position of leadership, in authority, are held to a much higher standard.
Mm.
I think that's something as a general concept we all understand and get on board with. But what are your reflections on how and where has there been this disconnect between our community and actually putting this into practice? Because quite often you hear conversations where that's actually not the case. You don't, or oh, actually, we don't know how to hold scholars to a higher level. Like, who does that? How do we bridge that gap from we know this as a concept to this is now happening in practice?
Yeah. So I think that in say like a Muslim context, you go back to like maybe historically, Islamically, right? When you had states and they were running things, those checks and balances were there. The accountability was there. Judges were removed.
Mm.
if they were in breach. And a lot of the times these judges were scholars as well, because when you put somebody in a position of power, we know, everyone knows this, power can corrupt, right? And you have to be on top of it, which is why one of the seven, the hadith about the people that are given shade and God's shade when there's no, the day there's no shade, the seven people, the first one is a just ruler, because that's such a difficult thing to be.
Mm.
That person's got a special status with God, because if you look at our history, how many of them were up to that level,
Mm.
right? A lot of them in power, when you're in power, you're known to ask, known to known to question you. You can easily get carried away, and that's the weakness of the human being.
Mm.
That's the power of the ego if it's not been worked on. And we see that with the story of Iblis in the Quran, that he, was unchecked. And when somebody came along, like Adam alayhi salam, he falters. So I think that the part and parcel of it is that we, a lot of us are migrants, our grandfathers or fathers, came to this country. We set up our own institutions. We've slowly built them, and this kind of, some bodies that have, some type of affiliation, mosques, but they're not. It's kind of very loose. It's not backed by government. It's not. They don't have legal backing. So I think, by and large, a lot of places have been left to run things themselves. And then I think that it's just that we've just not been thinking these things are going to happen. We just didn't
Mm.
imagine these type of things would happen. Or just you said, like, that idea of shock. No, this can't be true.
Yeah.
Uh, just the shock of it. But I think there's enough cases now. There's enough now, research coming out, to tell us that, look, no, this happens in every
Mm.
community, and we're not going to be, any exception to it. So it's happening in our community as well. I know from my experience, and I'm sure you do as well, and Dr. Rahman as well. People are in the field. We will come across cases where
Mm.
people tell us this happened to me, that happened to me, but your general public is not hearing those kind of stories. They're not coming across those types of people, so they're when they do, they're just in complete shock that this could happen. So I think that it's just lack of awareness and lack of thinking of these types of concepts, because this thing of covering sins,
Mm.
even some people who, are imams themselves have said things like this, not having thought things through and really understanding how. I think part of it is not understanding how abuse works
Yeah.
and the harm of it and the harm of abuse. And Dr. Rahman was saying that if they're not listened to, if they're not accepted, then how that compounds. So I think part of it is not only what the discussion we're having about this accountability and all the rest of it, but I think also just at a general level, we need to enhance our understanding of abuse, how it impacts people, and the damage it creates. And then I think once you understand that, then you realize, oh my God, this is really important. This cannot be, we have to take as many preventative actions to stop this from
Yeah.
happening. So I think that's a big part of it.
Jazakallah khair. Dr. Rahmanara, I think it'd be quite useful for you to maybe give us some reflections on how does the general public, right? So there's some people that have been asking which case we're referring to. There's a case coming out of the United States from an organization called Al Maghrib. You can look it up online. There was a lot of social media chat about it, individuals talking about it. I know a lot of people that said they felt very heavy. They're kind of unable to compute in their head how to deal with this. There's a real psychological impression that has been left on people, kind of going through the details of the case. So if you could perhaps talk us through how do we deal with this on an individual level, and I guess, yeah, from the psychological perspective of it.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things there in terms of how do we deal with it and who are we thinking about when we're saying that question as well. So obviously you've got the individuals who are directly impacted, and that's, that's where my mind, certainly, that's the first place it kind of goes to. So in terms of that individual or those people, it's very much a case of, well, that's going to be their individual journey. It's not going to be a linear process. They're going to have many ups and downs. They're going to require lots of forms of interventions and forms of support. As I mentioned before, a lot of that will actually come from close members, and a lot of that will also be professional support as well. So you'll have the specialist support, you'll have the more generic support as well.
Mm.
If they're fortunate, not everyone does get that support. So I've come across lots of cases where people are literally just suffering in silence because there's nowhere for them to go, nowhere for them to report, and no one's ever heard of their case. Now, so you've got that person, but it's also important to remember, whilst you've got the direct victims, you've also got indirect victims. And that usually is actually the family members of the individuals who committed the offences. And that group of people is actually, they are very much overlooked in this situation, and they are hidden victims, I would say.
Mm.
They suffer, but they go completely unrecognized in society. So one of the first things we also need to think about is, who are those individuals and how can we collectively as communities support those individuals as well? That obviously doesn't mean everyone needs to be doing something, even the majority actually just stepping back and giving space to those families. That in itself is a form of mercy and compassion to those individuals. When we're thinking more collectively, it is natural that communities are going to be in shock, especially if it's things, people have not come across before. Even though I've worked in this sector, I've spoken to lots of different survivors, every single case still shocks me and it still kind of hits you really hard. But on a collective level, I would say that actually the most powerful mechanism for healing is to come together and to support one another. So there will be people who do need to express emotions, and some of those emotions are going to be really difficult. They need to be able to do that without being judged, but it needs to be in spaces that offer safety and that still preserve, a certain etiquette and dignity of individuals and communities. That's something that's quite difficult to do on larger platforms. So obviously there was a huge social media kind of backlash to the case in the States. On those kind of platforms, it's very difficult to have that safe kind of space. So it tends to be that you can do that in smaller spaces, whether that's offline or offline or online. If it is in online spaces, you've got to think about having clearly identified individuals who will set the parameters for such discussions. They'll ensure that there's a respectful environment that's being upheld and that actually the sanctity of each person is still maintained. As I mentioned, people will have pain, they'll have grief, they'll have things they'll need to express. So it's important to make those spaces safe and conducted in a respectful manner. And we've got to remember that there are many invisible victims out there, many people who have never been able to come forward and will never be able to come forward for lots of different reasons. And so those individuals in particular, they may be getting re-traumatized. So we've got all of these different things happening. So the more we can try and provide those controlled and supportive environments, then inshallah, the better that will be. But there is a lot of healing that can be done collectively. And then if you kind of bring it down a little bit and you think about, okay, so each of us think about our own social circles. What can we do within those social circles? Even if it's the case that you can just speak to one person who just wants to talk it through, just the two of you, actually, that's more than enough. You may not have any answers, you may have more questions than anything else, but just the idea that two of you can get together and just have a safe, trusted conversation, that will be a form of healing. We've obviously had a lot of people who do want to talk about the most recent case, and that's understandable. But it's really important that we think about how we speak, where we speak, and in what capacity as well. Is what we say, is that going to just cause further harm, or is it going to actually benefit communities? This other thing, Shaykh Amer also touched upon this, and we touched upon this before, the idea that actually, have we really understood the situation? Have we understood the mechanisms by which abuse occurs? Or is it just about us venting our personal frustrations? Because if that's what we're doing, then guaranteed we're going to cause further harm. So instead of actually helping in that situation, we become part of the problem. So I think, especially today when you've got social media, it's so important to really just step back and think before we speak, particularly on those kind of public platforms. The other element which you've also just touched upon is the idea of that people will be looking to the leaders in our communities. And those leaders will be required to speak out. As Sheikh said, it comes with a job description.
Yeah.
So everyday community members, they will be actively looking for some guidance in these kind of situations. And, so we will need that leadership. The most recent example that I've seen, which, there's been quite a few different initiatives, but I was quite impressed with the way this particular initiative was done, and that was by the Female Scholars Network. So they've just released an article on the Muslim Matters blog, and that's an example, a really good example of how, scholars across the world, female scholars across the world, and I believe I think they spoke to some male scholars as well. They got together, they conferred, they consulted, they sought expertise on the topic. They didn't just assume that they knew. They consulted various people who had knowledge on the topic and the area. And based on that, they made a really well-informed and detailed statement that, inshallah, will help lots of different people in different ways.
Jazakallah khair. I am really aware of the time. We would very much like to also fit in some questions. What I would request is that if you're able to direct your questions to Tahra, we'll try and pick up as many as we can. I'm going to jump a little bit to maybe talk a little bit about how we challenge text. So we're talking about Quran and Sunnah here, because our research and other research has certainly shown that there are times where text is used to misuse positions of power. So, for example, in sacred research, we had people saying to us that there's that hadith where if Allah had prescribed another to prostrate to, it would be the husband, as the reason for accepting continued abuse. Another was, that because someone is a sayyid, they're able to justify their action through that. And the case that we've been referencing illustrates, what happens when a teacher in a position of trust presents something that is fundamentally harmful, haram, a crime, but presents it in a way and packages it in a way to their victim that this is actually a way to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Essentially, it is a grooming process. Sheikh, to yourself, and I guess this question probably falls back on the notion of accountability, but can you talk a little bit about how we deal with a situation like this when we're presented with it as individuals, especially given that many of us have been hardwired or have been taught to generally not question or investigate text, and relying exclusively on scholars to tell us things and to explain things for us. And I've certainly experienced this idea, well, you shouldn't probably go and check, or you shouldn't do your own because you're not a sheikh. Don't go and read more because you probably won't understand it. You're not a sheikh. So if you can maybe just talk a little bit about on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the Sayyid thing, do you know what I thought of? I just thought of the companions, like, the what's called the Great Fitna that happened between Sayyidina Ali and Muawiyah. It's interesting how they didn't say, well, he's a Sayyid, he's the he's the
Yeah.
cousin of the Prophet and married to his daughter. He
Yeah.
must be right, so we should just listen. They disagreed with him. They disagreed with him. So it's interesting that the companions didn't have this understanding that we're from the family of the Prophet, so you should listen to what we say. Yes, they respected them, but that didn't mean they agreed with everything they said. So I think again, part of this is a disconnect from our seerah, disconnect from our history, understand, and like I was talking about how Sayyidina Umar was. For a lot of people, they're like, oh, I didn't know that. There's a lot of disconnect with our tradition in that sense. I think that the first starting point is to understand that fiqh, right? Fiqh, which is jurisprudence, is a human attempt. So the Quran is there, the Sunnah is there, but it's how you interpret the Quran and Sunnah. So the reason why we have different opinions among scholars is because they came to different conclusions based on the same evidence. And so that's the first thing. I think that it can be in our time and age, it can be quite dangerous just to have one teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what you should do is don't just go to the one imam and listen to him, or one scholar, and that's the only person you ever sit and listen to. Sit and listen to other people as well. If the scholar says, look, don't listen to anyone apart from me, that's a red flag.
Mm.
So you should have more than one teacher. You should cross check things. Well, do all scholars say that, or is it just my teacher that's saying that? So I think having more than one teacher, because I know I'm thinking of people who just go to one mosque, there's one imam, and that's it. Whatever he says goes,
Yeah.
and can be quite dangerous, because he's a human being. The other thing is, if we look at our tradition, this idea of, well, we can't question the imam, or we can't question the scholar. I'll go back to Umar Khattab, and we all know the story. It's the story when he's giving the sermon and he's wanting to put a cap on the mahar, the dowry, and a woman says to him, but God doesn't do that. And Omar says the woman is right and I am wrong, or the man is wrong. So again, they didn't seem to have this understanding that you under no circumstances can question. And if you're not going to question Omar al-Khattab, he's like, one of the greatest companions ever. Now, there's not going to be no Omar again. But they felt comfortable to
Mm.
question him. So the environment that the Prophet created, the tarbiyah that he gave the companions, is not what we've got right now. If a woman can question Omar, are you telling me you can't question your local imam or your local scholar? Like, who's your scholar and who's Omar, right? So again, we're going back to our tradition. We'll find the answers. And the
Mm.
thing is, with that hadith, let's just come to that hadith, about if Allah had prescribed another to prostrate, it would be to the husband. The first thing is, He didn't prescribe you to prostrate to
Yeah.
your husband. It said if. So first of all, it's not being prescribed. It's if, right? So it's giving you an example that, look, at this is the kind of status of a husband. Now, what type of husband is the Prophet ﷺ talking about? Think about this logically. Would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala order a wife to submit to an abuser, or a husband who's not looking after the family or of bad character? It makes no sense whatsoever.
Mm.
Or are we talking about, an upright person who is merciful, who's gentle, like the Prophet ﷺ, or like one of the great companions, right? Who's dutiful, takes care. Yeah, you want to follow somebody like that.
Mm.
So it's using our logic as well. Another thing is, did the Prophet go around saying to his wives, by the way, if Allah had prescribed anyone to prostrate, it would be to the husband? Like, we don't see this in the Prophet. The Prophet is not doing this. It's not, we don't know any of the companions that went around throwing the hadith around like that either.
Mm.
So if they're not doing it, why would we do it? So when you look at it, when you actually start analyzing what's going on, what you find is that people, they will use any part of Quran or Hadith which fits their narrative or fits their situation. So I mean, I'll talk about my own situation. People come, couples come. Often the wife will say, "Sheikh, tell my husband what his duties are. You know, tell him what Islam says about looking after the wife." And he'll say, "Well, Sheikh, tell my wife, the status of the husband." They've got no interest in the Quran. So not at that point. It's
Mm.
like, no, what can I use as leverage that will bolster my position?
Yeah.
And so what you actually find is that people use the Quran Sunnah. People use the Quran Sunnah, right? And usually what it is, it's to satisfy their ego desires or ego wants. That's what's really going on. And this is why you get manipulation. And this happens with parents as well. If you don't
Mm.
do such and such, you're going to be a disobedient child. I'm not going to make dua for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop talking to you, right? That's got nothing to do with birrul walidain, to be, being your parents. That is control. That's there to make you submit, because you're so weak, your argument's so weak, you can't get the person to understand. You can't convince the person through just talking to them. So you need something extra to that will make them submit. That's really what's going on. So they're not using the Quran and Sunnah because out of sincerity. It's using it to fulfill their ego desire, which is why the intention behind when people quote these things is extremely important. I remember one of our teachers, Shaykh Amer one of the sisters asked him, said, my husband keeps saying, I might take a second wife, I might take a second wife. And I remember the way he responded. He responded by quoting the hadith that it's not permissible to scare another Muslim. So he understood that what you're doing it to put her down, or you're doing it, to irritate her, to annoy her. So he saw through the intention behind that statement, and he said, "Look, you're not allowed to scare another Muslim. That what you're doing is not correct." Even though he's not saying anything, black and white, which is wrong in that sense. So I think that what people need to understand is that people do use the Quran Sunnah for their leverage. You get this, beggars will do it. You go to certain Muslim countries and they say, for the sake of Allah, for the sake of the Prophet, they'll give you a hadith. They do, so beggars will do it. Other people will do it. Parents will do it. Couples will do it. There's lots of people will use, just because a person's quoting Quran hadith doesn't mean that the intention behind it is sincere. Right, the intention behind it, and that's why you're feeling something in your gut because it's the energy with which it's coming through, and you pick it up, and that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Istafti qalbak walau aftak al muftun." When ask your heart the fatwa, even if the muftis are saying it's okay. So the muftis are saying it's fine, it's permissible. Something in your heart saying, I'm not sure, I'm not sure. So the Prophet said, "Iftifti qalbak," like ask your heart. Right. So if something is being displayed, whether it's by whoever is displaying it, whether it's a scholar, a preacher, whoever it is, and it doesn't sit right in your heart, just take a step back and go and do your research. Go and find out. Just because somebody said it doesn't mean you have to follow it. There's lots of scholars out there. There's lots of different approaches. Maybe another scholar what they say will resonate with you in a way that what this person's saying doesn't resonate. So I think you have to don't just put all your eggs into one basket, and just using your intellect, like in some kind of Indo-Pak culture, a lot of Quran teachers would get the little kids to massage them and to say it's khidmat, this is khidmat, service for, this is like you're doing khidmat for your teacher. Okay, did the Prophet used to get little kids to massage him? It's very simple. You just look at, does this make sense? What this person is saying, does it actually make sense? It makes no sense, right? You should be doing khidmat for the other people. The scholars should be serving the people, not the other way around. And when if you get into a situation where you're getting used for their benefit, then you have to question that. There was a brother who said to me that he was in a situation where he was studying with a scholar, and he said that it got to a point where he had a hospital appointment. His child was in hospital. The person phoned him up. His teacher said, "Where are you?" He goes, "I'm at the hospital. My son had to go into hospital for whatever reason." And he just ignored what he said and said, "Okay, so when are you coming to pick me up?" And he goes, and that was the light bulb moment. I thought, this person doesn't care about me. Like, my son is in hospital. Like, what are you talking about? And then when he spoke to his wife said, "That's abuse." And that was the point where he actually pulled back and thought, wait a minute, this isn't, something's wrong here.
Yeah.
So you can cover it as khidmat, you can cover it as respect for your teacher, whatever it is, but we have enough in our tradition to check things by, does this correlate with the Prophet? Does this correlate with our other principles?
And I think what you're talking about is really interesting, because there really is an element of what we know and feel, and parents will know this feeling of, well, it doesn't feel right, like you kind of have this sixth sense almost when it comes to your kids or to the people that are around you. But Dr. Rahman, I wanted to bring you in on, I guess there's two questions, but I'm just going to ask this one first. I have been in conversations where people do not understand how people end up in a very vulnerable situation, or how, there's people that said, well, I can't believe this person let that happen to them. Can you talk a little bit about how, what I guess what the situation is for a very vulnerable individual who ends up in a situation that is harmful and perhaps doesn't recognize that it's harmful, especially in the context of spiritual abuse and everything that we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things there. So you spoke about vulnerability, but actually all of us are vulnerable because we're human. So by because of the human nature, we have been created in a vulnerable state. We all have specific needs and desires and wants and things that we need just to function healthily. And if any of those are lacking, then we're going to look to try and find places where we're going to find those things. So often when we see like young people, for example, when they're sort of going off the rails and they're experimenting and doing new things, part of that might be hormonal, yes, but actually a lot of it is about there's something I need. I haven't had that need met yet. So where can I find that need? Where will I find that place? And usually it's about belonging. It's about having affection. It's about having, close-knit networks. It's about having people you can confide in. So in that sense, we all have vulnerabilities, which if someone who is abusive in nature and can spot that vulnerability, then it's very easy for them to take advantage of that. So that's the first thing about vulnerability. The second thing is about awareness. So do we understand, firstly, abuse? Do we understand what's okay, what's not okay? Do we understand about personal boundaries? Has anyone taught us about personal boundaries? What does that mean when you're a child? What does that mean when you're a teenager? What does that mean when you're an adult? Just because people are happily married in healthy families, it doesn't mean that actually you potentially may not fall into that kind of vulnerable situation. If you haven't had that knowledge imparted to you, if no one's ever taught you that X, Y, and Z is okay, and actually this is not okay, like the example the Sheikh just gave, I've seen many cases like that where actually it's adult individuals, they're very learned, they're on their own path to knowledge, but they're being taken complete advantage of. And they don't realize because actually they've not had, no one's been there to say, actually, a healthy relationship in this kind of context, it looks like this. And in your kind of context, this is what it should be. So the idea that we need to be aware of abuse, all forms of abuse, and what that looks like in different contexts. And within that kind of setting, I would say as well, I was talking previously about the idea of families and parents and communities and how powerful we can actually be. If you think about it, everyone here probably accesses some sort of community service at some point in some way, shape, or form. If we were to make certain demands of those services to say, you know what, I want your organization to have a safeguarding lead. I want to know who that person is. I want their name, their contact number, and an email address to be made available to anyone who walks through the door of your institution. If everyone who is accessing that service makes that demand, that organization has to listen. If you also say to them things, basic things like, when I walk through the doors of your institution, I want there to be clear communication on a notice board somewhere saying what we can expect as service users for your organization and also how we are expected to conduct ourselves. And within there, things like what are the boundaries, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. If there's going to be children's classes there, can you put up simple posters to communicate the message to children? Things like what are the boundaries around your personal self? The idea that no one should see your underwear, for example. No one should see your private parts. You can do it in a way where it's still sensitive. You're taking into account the sensitivities of the situation. You're not being explicit, but also you're communicating at a level where any child who walks through that institution will know, okay, so this is what's okay and this is what's not okay. And you can do that in a very, very simplified format. But if we are, as community members, as parents, as just general community members as well, if we're making those demands of our institutions, then that's a really powerful position to be in. We can put institutions in a position where actually they have to listen to us, because that vulnerability and how exploitation occurs is because those measures are not in place. And so a young person, for example, might find themselves in a position where the conditions around them just perfectly facilitate for someone else to take advantage of them. And there's no accountability then, there's no structure there, there's nothing to kind of make them realize this is wrong, this is not acceptable, and this person can be held to account. So it's thinking about those wider kind of contextual factors, but also going back to the fact that actually all of us have vulnerabilities, and it's just the simple things that we can put in place and demand of our institutions to help prevent some of that happening.
Yeah, and I really think the kind of points that the Sheikh made before about accountability, and that is actually fundamental, not just within within our deen, but how that translates into our practical spaces is really important. I want to touch on one last question to put to both of you before we move on to questions from our participants. And this is kind of moving a little bit to this side, but I feel like we need to have, I guess, touch on the public discourse on abuse and Islamophobia. And this is particularly pertinent just now with everything that's going on in the media, very public discussions about abuse and about grooming. And from within our community, we have this real fear of airing dirty laundry, that it's going to invite more Islamophobia, it's going to invite more of a clash. And this is actually one thing that our research really uncovered, and we weren't expecting it, that there's such an immense role that Islamophobia plays in disclosing and reporting and seeking help from abuse. And that kind of goes from the police all the way down to masajid, all the way down like to your home. It's kind of across the board. And there will always be those who believe that reporting harm causes greater damage to the religion. And really what I'm looking for is advice that you would give to ensure that we're fulfilling our duty. So Sheikh, I'll come to you first. What steps can communities take to create an environment where reporting harm is viewed as a necessary act of justice rather than a betrayal of religious values? Because I think there really is a disconnect between those two things. And this links to the broader point that you've made of well, how do Islamic principles guide us in situations where protecting an individual's dignity conflicts with the need to prevent harm and seek justice?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that we have to get clear is that we have a responsibility, obviously, to other people. We have a responsibility in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So God is all seeing and God is all hearing. And one day we're going to stand in front of God and we're going to be held accountable for our life. God's not going to say to us, what were the far right saying about you? What were other people saying about you? No, it's about somebody was a victim in your organization under your watch. They came to you for help, right? They were oppressed. Did you help the oppressed or did you help the oppressor? And none of us want to be resurrected with the oppressors, because it said that the people who oppress in this world, and when we think of oppression, we think of Palestine, we think of Syria, but oppression has different levels. That's oppression at the highest level. But a person can be an oppressor in their own home. A person can be an aid to an oppressor. So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Unsur akhaka zaliman aw mazluma." Help your brother if he's an oppressor or oppressed. So the companion said, "Well, we understand if he's oppressed, right? But how do you help the oppressor?" He said, "Stop him from oppression." And the thing is, not only do we have to help the oppressed, we have to help the oppressed. How do you help the oppressor? By stopping him. If this person's a perpetrator, the more they perpetrate, not only are they harming obviously the victim, which is massive in itself, they're harming themselves as well.
Mm.
Right? If you kill one person and you keep doing it and you end up killing 100, you're gonna have to answer for that. So you're actually by preventing them, by actually putting them away and getting them off the streets and putting them in prison and maybe go through rehabilitation and all the rest of it, you're actually doing them a favor as well, as much as you're preventing harm to your own community. So the first thing we have to get through to people is we fear God. That's who we fear. We don't fear the people, what people are going to say. That's the first thing. So
Mm.
we have to always remember it's God says in the Quran, fear God. He doesn't say fear people. That's number one. Number two is when that victim is also in the next life and is standing there complaining to God and says, "This person, I told them and they've done nothing." Do you really want to be in that position? Right? So this is not, I'm not trying to scare people. I'm trying to make it real that this is what's going to
Mm.
happen in the next life. So this is not, this is not frivolous. This is extremely serious. As much as what Dr. Rahmana is talking about, the victim and the harm, and and we see the some. I mean, I get people as well that come. The woman's 50 years old. She's got marital problems, and it's all because something happened 40 years ago. And people are still living with this. Still, people are still suffering. So the suffering is immense for the victim.
Mm.
But the hadith says, help your brother, the oppressor, and the oppressed. That's number one. Number two is, let's just say go with this theme of, well, if we talk about this, it will make things worse. It will make Islamophobia worse. Right. Now all the stuff which is, let's just take an example which we all know that what's happened in the Catholic Church. Right. So there was a cover up for many years, right? And now all the stuff is coming out. Has this improved the image of the Catholic Church, or has it done harm? Is it turned people away from the Catholic Church, or has it turned people to the Catholic Church? The answer is
Mm.
very clear. So cover up is not an option. In fact, if you speak up, then people will see. These people, they don't put up with abuse. They don't put. They stand for the truth. They stand for people who are abused. If you don't speak, the opposite is true. See these people, they're complicit. They don't speak up. They silently kind of don't really give it much. So they're aiding and abetting this. They're just part of the problem. So you
Mm.
actually make the Islamophobia worse. And the third thing is that Islamophobes will always say stuff, whether there's stuff there or not. That's their job. Their job is to make up stuff anyway. So that the Islamophobia is going to be there whether we do anything or we don't do anything. So we shouldn't really give them much weight. Coming back to the other thing which I was talking about was, so what is our duty then in front of God, right?
Mm.
Our duty is, like I said, harm has to be eliminated. This is a legal maxim. There's another one which is related from a hadith, la darara wa la dirar. This is a very important principle that
Mm.
we should all really, really take note of, and we should come back to over and over again. Harm is not to be inflicted, and it shouldn't be retaliated with harm. And this is because harm is oppression. Oppression's obviously unlawful. And we know in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the curse is upon the oppressors, right? So the curse is on the oppressors. One of like some scholars, like Ibn Najjar, is of the opinion that this principle of harm that shouldn't be afflicted nor retaliated with harm, he says it's so significant it encompasses half of all jurisprudence. So this is like a fundamental pillar of Islamic law, right?
Mm.
The harm should not be inflicted and it shouldn't be retaliated with harm. La darara wa la dirar. And linked to that is that other maxim, harm should be eliminated. Ad-dararu yuzal. And this ties in with hadith, and we know this hadith as well, just like the one about help your brother, the oppressed or the oppressed. I know most people know it. There's another one we all know, which is whoever amongst you sees a wrongdoing, man ra'a minkum al-munkar, what does the hadith says? فَلْيُغَيِّرْ
Mm.
بِيَدِهِ. Change it with your hand. فَإِن لَمْ تَسْتَطِعْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ. If you can't do it, فَبِلِسَانِهِ, then with his tongue. If you can't do it, فَبِقَلْبِهِ, Do it at least in your heart. That وَذَلِكَ أَضْعَفُ الْإِيمَانِ. That's the weakest form of faith. So if you see something wrong, you have to change it with your hand. If you cannot, you have to speak out. And most of us can speak out. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that when it comes to oppression, let's say the Palestinian issue, people are retreating, people are going out to protests, people are boycotting, right? Because why? They're enraged by the oppression, right? They're enraged by the oppression. But what about the oppression which is happening in our communities, done by Muslims to Muslims? Why is that not enraging us? Why does that not enrage us? Right? We're supposed to be against all forms of oppression, not just oppression which happens across the world. No, oppression that happens in our own communities, our families. So as you know, a lot of abuse happens in familial, situations. So families, so people know about these things. People know about things which are wrong. They see it in situations, yet they will remain silent. They will kind of blunt, oh, I don't want to get involved because it will create problems.
Yeah.
But then they're at the protest against oppression in Palestine. That doesn't make any sense. So you're not dealing with oppression which you can actually do something about, but the oppression which you can't really do much about apart from protest, you will go and do that. So it's misplaced, and we know this, that your first duty is to your inner circle first, and then it goes out. It's not the other way around. So if oppression is happening, if we're saying that abuse is harm and oppression, and we know it happens in the community, we know it happens amongst family and friends, so that means people know about it. And if you know about it, change it with your hand. You can't change it with your hand, change it with your tongue, right? They actually say, that if you're in a situation and oppression's happening and you can't and you're not going to do something about it, you should leave that situation. In other words, you can't be in a situation where there's oppression happening and you just stand by, a bystander. That's not an option. So I think these are very important principles that we have to understand, that our loyalty is not to an organization or to a scholar. Our loyalty is to God. Our loyalty is to God. Our accountability is to God. That's the person we're going to stand in front of us on one day, and he will take us to task for everything we did. And these things, these events which happen when oppression is presented to us, this is a test. This is God's test for you. What are you going to do now? Are you going to bury your head in the sand? Are you going to turn away from it? Are you going to pretend it didn't exist? Or are you going to stand with the oppressor? Because when that oppressor is in the next life, you'll be standing next to them. So these are serious, serious things for people's own akhirah.
Yeah, I mean that's very powerful, Sheikh, and I think it paints a really clear picture. So just kind of following on from what you've just said, Dr. Amara, can you perhaps talk a little bit about, so when we are in a position where we know harm has happened, someone has come and disclosed something, either to a family member or to leaders in an organization or to imams in a masjid, how should people deal with disclosures of abuse, and especially in situations involving minors? And I think just also, what are the obligations to both protect the victim and address the perpetrator? Just very quickly, inshallah, and then we're going to move on to questions, inshallah.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief. I think with regards to minors, it's very clear. If we become aware of a minor who is undergoing any form of harm, abuse, neglect, we have a legal duty and responsibility to report that. And I don't think there's anything in our religious tradition which would argue against that. Sometimes when adults come forward and they report, there's questions around, can we really believe that person? But what about this and what about that? And there's a lot of questioning that goes on around the authenticity of that person and the reliability of that person. Now, based on all the different people I've spoken to and the different forms of abuse that people have experienced, it's one of the hardest things to come forward and speak about and to disclose. So the fact that someone gets to a point after probably years of suffering to say, actually, this happened to me, that is probably their last call for help. So in terms of our response, it should be one of compassion. It should be one of actually, okay, what support do you need? We obviously will have various legal responsibilities depending on the age and the circumstances and the active threat to life potentially. So in those kind of situations, we'll have to do specific things. But on a very generic level, just being there, just supporting that person, just listening to that person, and just hearing what they've got to say and listening to what they want to happen next is really, really important. Because in a lot of these situations, individuals have their autonomy stripped away from them. So the idea that if they come and they make a disclosure to us and then we go off and we decide, oh, we're going to do this, this, and this, and we don't bother consulting them, actually, we've just made the situation 10 times worse. We need to listen to them and listen to what they are saying. I just want to add as well, just extending a little bit off what Shaykh Amer was saying. So it's really interesting. The Maori community in New Zealand, they have this incredible model where if someone commits an offence, as a community collectively, they actually see it as a failure of the community. So what they do is they welcome that person back into the community after they've served their sentence or whatever may have happened, whatever repercussions there may have been to the offence. And they look at, okay, where did we collectively as a community go wrong? Because if we're thinking about, all of these cases, and if we are really serious about change, we have to understand how was that person able to get into a situation where they committed this offence? What circumstances, what contextual factors, what else happened for that person in order to allow them to do that offending behaviour? We're not excusing their offence at all. We're not saying abuse is okay. We're not saying any of those things. We're trying to understand the process by which they got to that point. Because if we can break that down, that means we can then work backwards and start to put into place the preventative mechanisms on a collective basis so that actually we're keeping everyone safe. So I just wanted to add that into the discussion because I think that's really important. And in terms of what Sheikh was also saying about our sort of collective responsibility.
No, Jazakallah khair. I think that's a really interesting example because it ties in with what the Sheikh was saying about accountability and it being a community process. So we kind of have about 15 minutes left and there are quite a lot of questions. So I apologize, first of all, to everyone that we won't be able to go through all of them, but I will pick up maybe a couple that the Sheikh and Dr. Hamara can address. And also we are hoping to continue these conversations throughout the year. So, we will definitely be picking up some of the more nuanced questions that have come up that we can't address here. So the first question, very quickly, I'll put to you, Dr. Rahmanara, is somebody is asking, what is the difference between abuse and exploitation?
Okay, yeah, so that's a really good question, actually. So abuse is where you've got direct actions happening to an individual. So we normally talk about child sexual abuse and child sexual exploitation, but obviously you can have it in the adult context as well. But if we just take it in terms of a young person context, you've got the idea of forcing or persuading a child to be involved in various sexual activities. And it doesn't matter whether the child is aware or not, because because they're under the age of 18, they can't consent to that. So that's the abuse element. Where you've got the exploitation element, it's a form of child sexual abuse or form of sexual abuse. So it might be where you've got either an individual or a group taking advantage of a person, exerting coercion over them, exerting power and control, manipulation, deception, to force them into or deceive them into various activities. And again, it doesn't really matter if that person understands because they think they're consenting, but actually they're being manipulated and taken advantage of. I hope that's
Yeah, that's brilliant. Jazakallah khair. Sheikh, there's a question here. Should scholars have more accountability or responsibility to call out other people in positions of power where it could affect communities and the general public? Why do scholars take a back step in that regard?
Yes, they should. I think anything that you have the power to do something about to correct a wrong, you should do it to the best of your ability. I can't speak for why they don't do that. I think from what I can see, like I said, I don't think that that some of them have thought through how I mean, I think the starting point is if you don't like there's a principle in Islamic law that, to give a ruling on something, you have to understand what it is. And I think if you don't understand how abuse actually works, you don't understand what it is, I think that hampers your response then. Maybe you don't see it as as big as it should. And I think that there's a crossover in terms of some of the stuff we're talking about. Well, he's innocent until proven guilty. So like
Mm.
there's a misunderstanding of certain principles and not realizing, well, hold on, yeah, that is the general rule, but this is not the general rule. So I think part of it is having just not thought things through properly. And part of it is just human weakness, like thinking, oh, it's going to bring the mosque into disrepute, or it's going to affect it, or madrasa will get closed down, So I think part of it is just human weakness and not an understanding the enormity of their error. But I personally do think that if we increased our the knowledge amongst Imam scholars about abuse, how it works, the implications, just some of the stuff we've been talking about, reminding people, we sometimes need to be reminded. I think then you can readdress a lot of these issues. I
Mhm.
think it's just not a priority for a lot of places. They're just running on volunteers. They're trying to keep they've got volunteers. If they get rid of a teacher who they think maybe complaints been made about, they're like, well, who are we going to get to teach? They're looking at those kind of things, not understanding the impact. One of my friends, he does safeguarding in some parts of north of England, and he was saying that he met some committee members at a certain mosque and reminded them about the safeguarding, and they said, yeah, yeah, that's great, come in, do the training. But the point was he had to prompt them. They didn't come to him. And I think that's the problem. It's
Yeah.
not understanding that this is important, that not understanding like how things can go wrong, how badly things can go wrong. So I think again, it's increasing their understanding, bringing things to their forefront of their minds. Like for example, they might sack somebody, an abuser. They might sack someone, not understanding that that abuser is just going to go to another mosque or whatever and do the same thing again. So it's not a solution. So things that they think that they're doing right is to show them that this is not the appropriate response.
Jazakallah khair. We have a lot of questions, but I'm going to put this one to both of you. Um, does the concept of not hiding the sin of leaders in the community, is it similar to the leader of a household or family? How should family members who are victims respond as first steps? And is there literature or sources in our tradition on how to manage inner family abuse?
Again, I don't know what they didn't specify what type of abuse, but in essence, if there is abuse there and somebody knows about it, we have a responsibility collectively to do something about it. So in that situation might involve getting other family members involved, and that puts an end to the abuse. So basically, you have to do whatever it takes to put an end to the abuse. In some situations, that's not going to work, and you have to report it to the police. You have to get authorities involved. So be it. If you cannot keep yourself safe through other means, then you basically take whatever means you can to put an end to the abuse.
Rahnar, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I do want to just add there. So one of my key areas of working is in domestic abuse. And obviously within that kind of context, anyone in the family setting, they don't have to necessarily be living in that household, but if they're a member of the extended family, anyone can be someone who perpetrates abuse. What I've found in those kind of situations is that every day becomes about surviving. You don't actually get to live your life. You're surviving literally day to day, hour to hour, sort of minute to minute. And if you think about, well, why did Allah put us here? What's our purpose? It's not so that someone else can take the position of Allah in our life. And in a lot of domestic abuse cases where it's within the family context, that's what happens. The other person actually imposes themselves, or the other people impose themselves in a way where they take the status of Allah in that person's life. And that's horrifying, because you think that person has to then account for that when they meet Allah. So I think the responsibility is almost greater in terms of actually what can we do to stop this. When it is family, it's very, very messy in terms of trying to deal with it and how do you go forward. But actually, as Sheikh said, we do need to report those kind of things, especially when it's a case of you're in danger, your life's potentially at risk. We have to report those things. We have to enlist help and support where we can. I don't know if maybe a couple of my books might be of any use for this individual. If it is, feel free to share the references for those as well.
Yeah, no, we will, inshallah. Jazakallah khair for that. I'm
Can I,
gonna,
can I just
yeah,
add something quickly,
sure.
Maddie, to that? Is this idea of I come across this quite a lot, that this person's obviously in an abusive situation. Well, why are you accepting that? And it'll be often it's from the sake of my children. So this kind of concept we have, you stay in it for the sake of the children. If I say, if you didn't have any children, would you leave? I would leave. But I've got children, and not understanding the impact of being in a toxic relationship or an abusive relationship on the children, that's you're not doing them any favors when they grow up. That will affect their upbringing, and they will get married, and then they will have problems. And so, actually, again, we're talking about spiritual abuse here, but the understanding of divorce also needs to be clarified in our community, that divorce is something which is permissible. Yes, it's hated. You don't rush to it, but it is there in situations where, if you're like Dr. Rahman is saying, the person surviving day to day, that's not, God has not asked anyone to live like that. And so a person should be able to, exit from a relationship. Because people say, oh, but is it not that the throne of the God's throne will shake and this and that and all the rest of it? If you look at the companions, again, their understanding of Islam is far greater than ours. And we don't find this that with them. They were very, they're very accepting of divorce. If things didn't work out, they would go and get divorced. They would go and get remarried, and they would move on. That's famous story of the pivotal hadith on Khula is the one of the wife of Thabit. She comes to Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, I've got nothing to complain about Thabit, good character, everything, but just I fear disbelief. And disbelief here means that she wasn't attracted to him, and she felt that she might fall into infidelity. So the Prophet says, okay, will you give back the mahar, which was a garden? She said yes. Calls Thabit and says, look, take the garden back and give her a divorce. So, if you look at the companions, they didn't have this. They didn't feel, okay, I'm in this situation. I've got to be in this situation for the sake of God. That's not an Islamic concept.
Jazakallah khair. I am apologies to everyone because there are so many questions and I would love to ask them all, but I'm going to take one last one and hopefully wrap up by 9 o'clock. So this is somebody saying, Salam, in my work as a counselor, I work with many people who have been harmed or have harmed others. However, they are enmeshed between guilt and shame. Sometimes it feels their gut is telling them, or as their innocence has been broken, they cannot ask for help. Confused, and it affects their identity. Can the panel say a few words about guilt, shame, and the difference in Islamic psychology and Christian-based confession?
So I believe there is a difference from the theological perspective. Do you want to just address that, and then I'll come in and top up if that's okay?
Yeah, I mean, the question's quite general. Um, guilt is there if you do. I mean, if you do something wrong, you do tawbah, you feel bad about it, right? So there's guilt. I shouldn't have done that. But I think that what people need to understand is, okay, I'm feeling guilt or I'm feeling shame, but what I'm feeling that you're feeling something, but just because you're feeling it doesn't mean that it's actually sanctioned. So we have to look at what's the evidence. So when people come to me, they might say, "I'm feeling like this." I'll say, "But what's the evidence telling you? Did you do this wrong? No. Did you do that wrong? No. Did you do?" So I'm saying, okay, why are you feeling guilty then? If you've done all these things, why are you feeling guilt? So it's the feeling is one thing, but it's getting them to see, well, is that feeling based on evidence, or is that coming from somewhere else? It could be cultural reasons, it could be what the mother-in-law said, it could be gaslighting, whatever it is. So to actually get them to separate that, hold on, the feeling you've got, is it actually even based in reality or not? So you might be making something a reality which is not actually based on anything. So, like the concept of shame, the shame is on the oppressor. The shame is on the person who commits the sin, commits the crime against someone else. It's not on the person it's committed against. So it could be sometimes we have, obviously, izzat and sharam and all this kind of stuff. It's all cultural stuff, which is, people are made to feel in a certain way because of the discourse, but it's not actually rooted in evidence. So you say, look, well, explain to me what is the evidence for this? What's the basis for this? And very quickly, they start to realize, wait a minute, this is baseless.
Rahmanara, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add to that. So, just thinking, I'm going to go with guilt first. So, in a lot of victims, I see that victims carry a lot of guilt. They a lot of times they're questioning, I should have done this, I should have done that, if I had done this, if I had listened, if I had X, Y, Z, and the list just goes on. And when you explore it a bit deeper, what you find is that they've been taught to carry that guilt, and they believe that they are responsible for what's happened to them, when actually that's just a form of manipulation. In regards to those who might perpetrate abuse and the guilt that they may carry, I think that's really an element of your fitra coming out, and if anything, that's a positive sign. If there are individuals who have committed wrongdoing and they're feeling that guilt, now it's about, okay, how do I rectify it within a safe and halal kind of means. The other thing about shame is that shame is something that tends to be externally imposed onto people, and they don't have a say over it. It is very much that it's a case of it's superimposed onto them, and then they are forced to live within the parameters of that shame. And a lot of times you'll see, as Sheikh was saying, it's very much about the ethnic kind of cultural norms that we may abide by or impose upon ourselves. And actually, again, when we explore that in further detail, what we find is that those ethnic cultural norms actually oppose the principles of the faith. And when we look at the principles of the faith, they're much more open, they're much more broad, they're much more holistic. So what we actually are doing in those kind of cases, we're oppressing ourselves, and it tends to be community members who oppress those who are already oppressed through those imposition of shame. So shame is, as Sheikh said, it's not something we shouldn't carry that, because actually it's other people trying to impose it on us, and it actually is more a reflection of themselves and their own kind of ways of operating and understanding that situation. I hope that helps to add a bit of clarity.
Jazakallah khair. So we are 1 minute to 9. I just wanted to firstly say Jazakallah khair to you both, Shaykh Amer and Dr. Rahmanara, for your time, and for really giving us some very crucial information, detailed information. And I really hope that everyone has found it worthwhile. Like I said, we are hoping to continue these conversations throughout the year. It's the express purpose of Sacred as an organization. And I see the questions, and I know there'll be people sitting there thinking, I really wish you'd ask that. But yeah, inshallah, we will seek to address that, and inshallah invite you all back within those conversations. So Jazakallah khair, please do take the time to go and have a look at our website, and also Jazakallah khair to Unity Family Services who collaborated with us on this. If you have any further questions, any further queries, please do not feel do feel free to message us via email or on Instagram. One last thing, please do go and look at the support page for anyone who needs to follow up from this session, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.